Good evening, friends, and welcome. Tonight, we venture into the remote and shadowy corners of the wilderness, where the trees grow taller than the eye can follow. The wind carries secrets no one dares speak aloud, and the night itself seems alive. If you are listening alone, under dim light, or tucked in your blankets, be aware. Tonight's stories are not for the faint of heart. Some recount the kind of terror that makes you question what you thought you knew about the world. Some involve creatures that might be lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. And others involve the very real, very human fears that arise when isolation and nature collide. So settle in. Prepare your mind for a journey into the unknown. And remember, sometimes it's safer to simply listen and never turn around. Our first story begins with a man named Carl, a seasoned hiker who prided himself on venturing into the least accessible corners of the northern wilderness. Carl was the kind of person who didn't just hike trails. He traversed the untouched stretches of forest where the GPS would fail, and the maps barely existed. For years, he had built up an image among his friends as someone unflappable, fearless, a man who laughed at danger the way others might laugh at a passing storm. That summer, Carl decided to tackle a stretch of dense forest that bordered the lakes and bogs of northern Minnesota. He wanted solitude, and he wanted challenge. But what he didn't anticipate was that the forest itself had plans for him that went far beyond a simple hike. From the very first evening, Carl sensed the subtle oddities. The forest wasn't silent, but the sounds were unusual, too rhythmic, almost deliberate. The way the branches scraped against one another sounded more like whispers than natural friction. And the occasional snapping of twigs didn't always align with the patterns of animals he knew so well. At first, he chalked it up to nerves, to the way the mind plays tricks when one is completely alone. But there was a feeling creeping over him like a cold hand on the nape of the neck that this forest was watching, not with eyes necessarily, but with awareness, with intelligence, with a patience that only something ancient could hold. The first night, Carl set up his tent on a small clearing near a shallow stream. It was as close to idyllic as one could imagine. The water's soft babble, the canopy above thick enough to shelter him but sparse enough to see the stars. Yet as he lay inside, trying to fall asleep, he heard a voice. Not a human voice, not exactly, but it mimicked a human tone, a faint whisper calling his name, just out of reach, just beyond the tent walls. Carl, Carl, it said, almost teasingly. He froze, convinced it was his imagination. No one could possibly be out here. There were no roads for miles, no hikers expected in this wilderness. Yet the voice persisted, soft but insistent, a repetition that pulled at the edges of reason. His rational mind argued against it, citing stress, fatigue, and the eeriness of isolation. But his body cold and alert, knew something was wrong. Morning brought light, but no comfort. Carl packed up quickly, moving to higher ground, hoping that elevation would provide perspective, a better vantage, and perhaps distance from whatever had toyed with him in the darkness. But as he hiked, he noticed signs he hadn't seen before. Rocks stacked in unnatural formations. The bark on certain trees marked with scratches that resembled letters, perhaps even a warning. He couldn't interpret them fully, but they filled him with unease. The further he ventured, the more he realized he was being guided, or perhaps herded, by the forest itself. The path he intended to take seemed subtly shifted. Obstacles appeared where none should have been, and sounds followed him with no visible source. On the second night, Carl stopped near a small grove of pines that had been struck by lightning long ago. A place where the trees were jagged and blackened, almost sculptural in the moonlight. He set up his tent, trying to remain practical. He hung his food, secured his gear, and maintained a fire to ward off predators. That night, the whispering returned, this time coupled with the sensation of movement just beyond the firelight. Shadows flickered between the trees, elongated and unnatural. Carl tried calling out, rationalizing that it could be another hiker, lost or wandering, but no one answered. He strained his ears, but the only responses were the whispers, the wind, and the faint crackle of the fire. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by jolts of awareness. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, setting his heart racing. By the third day, Carl understood that this was no ordinary forest. The trails seemed to twist behind him as he passed, landmarks changed, and he occasionally caught glimpses of movement from the corner of his eyes. Dark shapes that weren't animals he recognized. Figures that vanished when looked at directly. His confidence waned, replaced with a creeping fear that the wilderness he had loved was now a predator in itself. He attempted to maintain logic, noting that stress, hunger, and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind, but the visceral reactions, an adrenaline surge at a faint sound, the need to run when nothing appeared tangible, were undeniable. It was as though the forest was testing him, gauging his responses, feeding on his unease. The realization hit him hard. This was a story he would recount to others, not one he would walk away from lightly. Later that day, as he navigated a particularly dense thicket, Carl found signs of recent passage. Footprints that were neither human nor any animal he knew. Large, uneven, almost humanoid, but wrong, like a distorted reflection of man. He paused, studying them, the hairs on his arms standing on end. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to run back towards civilization. But the landscape now felt like a trap. It wasn't a matter of distance. The forest seemed alive, altering paths, pushing him towards certain zones. By nightfall, he stumbled into a clearing that overlooked a still lake. The moon reflected perfectly in its glassy surface. It was beautiful, almost calming, but that calm was deceptive. In the reflection, he thought he saw movement, a figure just beyond the tree line, crouching low, watching him. When he turned his head, nothing was there. When he looked back, the reflection held the image for a heartbeat longer than possible. Panic began to tighten its grip. As he set up camp that evening, Carl made the conscious decision to stay vigilant. He built the fire high, kept his knife within reach, and moved cautiously. The whispers began again, now more distinct, almost articulate. "You shouldn't be here. You can't leave. Stay." The forest, the night, the figure or figures outside, all seemed to merge into a single entity of dread. Carl's mind wavered between disbelief and certainty. He tried grounding techniques, repeating logical mantras, telling himself he would hike out in daylight, that the wilderness was not malevolent by choice. Yet each sound, each shadow, each unnatural movement reinforced the opposite. The forest had claimed him in a subtle psychological way, and he could feel his own strength being tested, his courage evaluated. Throughout the night, the terror escalated. Some presence, circulated around his camp, visible only peripherally, indistinct, and yet undeniably there. Carl tried to maintain focus on his breathing, on the warmth of the fire, on any tangible point to anchor his mind. But the whispers evolved, adopting tones he knew. Voices of people he loved, memories distorted into pleas, threats, cries of need. He screamed into the night, but no one answered. Morning would come eventually, he hoped. But the forest, alive with quiet malice, seemed determined to make him question every perception. Even as dawn approached, and the first light filtered through the trees, Carl knew he had survived something far beyond a simple hike. He had confronted an intelligence, a presence, or perhaps his own inner demons magnified, reflected, and distorted by isolation, fear, and the wilderness. By the morning, he found himself exhausted, weary, and yet driven to continue. The footprints, the whispers, the shadows, all lingered at the edges of memory, threatening to overwhelm rational thought. Carl understood that survival would require more than physical endurance. It required psychological resilience, the ability to navigate not just terrain, but the liminal space between reality and perception, between fear and logic. He packed his gear, taking care to avoid paths that felt wrong, keeping the fire smoldering as he moved, marking landmarks cautiously, noting the unnatural arrangements of stones and trees that might signal more than coincidence. Every step was deliberate, every sound monitored, every pause considered in relation to the unknown. He was no longer hiking for pleasure or exploration. He was hiking for life itself. And the forest was no longer a backdrop, but a character in the story. One with intent, patience, and a quiet hunger for fear. By mid-morning, Carl's mind was on high alert. Each crack of a branch, Each rustle of leaves seemed amplified, echoing in his head like a warning bell. He moved carefully, following what he thought was the main trail, but soon realized that the forest had a cruel sense of irony. The landmarks that once appeared familiar now seemed distorted, twisted in ways that defied logic. Trees that should have been mere pines now appeared massive, their trunks swollen, bark darkened as if charred, and branches stretching toward the sky in impossible angles. Shadows shifted unnaturally as he passed, dancing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Carl's pulse quickened, yet he forced himself to remain calm, whispering to himself that this was survival, not panic. But every instinct in his body screamed otherwise. The day wore on slowly, each step heavier than the last. Carl's stomach rumbled, and the limited provisions in his pack were becoming more pressing. He found a small creek and filled his water bottle, trying to steady his hands. But as he bent down, he glimpsed movement in the reflection on the water. A figure, tall, dark, humanoid but impossibly elongated, stood at the edge of his vision. When he looked directly, it vanished. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through every vein. Yet he forced himself to continue. Survival demanded that he not succumb to fear entirely. But the forest, it seemed, had its own designs. It was teaching him, testing him, playing a game of observation and endurance that he had never signed up for. By late afternoon, the terrain grew even more treacherous. The path was littered with fallen trees, bogs, and mud pits that threatened to swallow his boots. Every step required caution. Carl's mind raced, cataloging the possibilities. Animal attack, injury, disorientation, or worse, an unknown presence stalking him. He had never believed in the supernatural, not truly. But this place challenged every rational explanation. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally toward him. Shapes just outside his vision hinted at something intelligent, something observing, waiting. He tried to talk to himself aloud, rationalizing, grounding, reminding himself that humans are masters of perception, prone to misinterpretation. Yet even his own voice seemed to falter in the overwhelming silence, punctuated only by the soft rustle of leaves and distant calls he couldn't identify. Night approached faster than expected. Carl found a small clearing, barely wide enough for his tent, and decided to make camp. He built a modest fire, the flames crackling louder than usual, echoing through the trees. But the firelight offered little comfort. The shadows it cast seemed to move independently, stretching toward him, recoiling, then returning. Carl kept the knife in his hand, senses sharpened. And then he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Not the wind, not the usual rustle of leaves, but a voice. Low, deliberate, almost human in cadence. You shouldn't be here. He froze, every muscle taut, eyes scanning the perimeter of his camp. Nothing. The voice repeated, slightly louder, and then Another joined in, imitating the tone of panic, the tone of someone crying for help. Carl's stomach dropped. This was no ordinary forest phenomenon. Throughout the night, the whispers evolved, becoming more articulate, weaving phrases he recognized from his own life. Memories, regrets, and fears. Carl, come with us. It's safer. You belong here. He couldn't tell if the voices were coming from the distance or from within his mind, but the effect was devastating. Sleep became impossible. He remained alert, watching the fire, listening intently. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a branch became a potential threat. The moon rose high, but its light was filtered through dense foliage, casting intricate patterns that distorted reality. Carl understood one undeniable truth. This night and these woods were designed to test more than just physical endurance. They were probing the boundaries of sanity itself. Dawn broke slowly, revealing a landscape transformed. Mist clung to the trees. Dew glittered like fragile crystal, and the soft hum of insects returned to the undergrowth. Yet the forest's beauty was deceptive. Every step forward reminded him that he was navigating not just geography, but something far older, something patient and calculating. As Carl pressed onward, he noticed new markers, stones stacked in deliberate patterns, scratched symbols on tree trunks he couldn't identify. Someone or something had been here before him, leaving warnings he didn't fully comprehend. Anxiety surged, but he pushed forward. Logic demanded progress, but instinct warned him constantly. A subtle, unshakable pressure at the back of the mind. By midday, Carl reached a shallow river crossing. The water was deceptively calm, but as he prepared to step in, he caught a glimpse of movement along the opposite bank. A humanoid shape, low and crouched, watching him. Carl froze, holding his breath. The figure didn't move until he blinked. And when he opened his eyes again, it was gone. The encounter shook him more than any physical obstacle. The forest was no longer passive. It had become active, aware, almost sentient. He considered turning back, retracing his path to safety, but he knew, instinctively, that the terrain had shifted. Paths that should have led him out now led deeper in. The forest had him. Night came again, colder and more oppressive than the previous evening. Carl's fire barely pierced the shadows, and the whispers had grown more insistent, more personal. They began to imitate voices from his past, friends, family, his own internal doubts. The effect was disorienting, destabilizing, almost hallucinatory. Carl realized he could not rely solely on his physical senses. He needed to maintain a mental anchor, some fragment of reality he could trust. He repeated his plan aloud. I survive. I follow the river. I reach the road. Nothing else matters. Yet even as he spoke, the forest responded, reshaping, redirecting, testing his resolve. In the early hours, Carl heard something distinctly unnatural. Footsteps, not light and tentative, but heavy and deliberate, circling his camp. He could feel their rhythm in the ground beneath him. Then came a low growl, not of a bear or wolf, but something otherworldly, echoing in a way that suggested intelligence and malice. Carl clutched his knife, heart hammering, eyes wide. He held still, calculating, waiting for an opening. The figure emerged just beyond the firelight, a humanoid silhouette, elongated, with a head that tilted unnaturally. Its movements were disjointed yet purposeful. Carl could barely comprehend its anatomy, the way its limbs twisted at impossible angles. And yet, it moved with the patience of a predator, measuring, watching, waiting. The forest itself seemed to pulse around it, shadows coiling like living tendrils. Carl understood in that moment that this was not a single creature, but a manifestation of the forest's will. Survival required cunning, not brute force. He waited until the creature shifted its attention elsewhere, then silently backed, moving inch by inch, shadow to shadow. Every step was calculated, deliberate. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the treetops, he had put significant distance between himself and the entity, though he could feel its gaze following, unseen, relentless. Each creek, each fallen log, each ridge he crossed was a negotiation with the forest itself. He realized that survival depended on understanding the rhythm of this wilderness, the patterns of its inhabitants, both natural and unnatural. Only then could he hope to escape. As morning progressed, Carl's body grew weary, but his mind sharpened. He observed everything: the rustle of leaves, the way shadows fell, the subtle shifts in temperature that might indicate movement. He learned to read the signs, to anticipate what might be coming next. By midday, he had reached a high ridge overlooking a sprawling valley, mist clinging to the trees below. From this vantage, he could see patterns in the landscape, paths that might lead out. Yet he also noticed anomalies, areas of forest that seemed darker, more compact, almost impervious to light. The forest was a living map, dynamic and unpredictable, revealing escape routes only as it deemed necessary. Carl's pulse quickened with both hope and dread. Carl began his descent into the valley cautiously, each step deliberate, each sound noted. The forest was no longer just a setting. It had become an active force, almost sentient, guiding and misguiding him at will. Every shadow, every flicker of movement drew his attention. The trees seemed alive, their gnarled branches reaching outward as if to block his passage, while the forest floor appeared to shift underfoot, softening or hardening unpredictably. Carl's instincts told him to keep moving, to maintain a rhythm, but the whispers persisted, quiet at first, then swelling into murmurs that echoed through the valley like ghostly calls. "Carl, you can't escape. Stay." The voice mimicked loved ones, a cruel trick of memory and sound, designed to break him. His stomach twisted, yet he pressed onward. Survival demanded focus, even as fear clawed at the edges of his mind. As he navigated the valley, Carl noticed footprints, large, irregular, not matching any known animal. He traced them cautiously, wary of a trap. The prints led him to a clearing, and at first glance, it seemed innocuous. Soft moss underfoot, a faint breeze rustling leaves. But as he stepped forward, he realized the clearing wasn't empty. There were signs of habitation, makeshift shelters, remnants of fires, and the faint smell of smoke. Someone, or something, had been here recently. Carl's pulse accelerated, but he forced himself to examine the surroundings carefully. The shelters were crude but effective, constructed from branches, leaves, and mud. No footprints suggested normal human activity. These were deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. The forest, he realized, was not only alive, it had a history, secrets it was guarding. Hours passed, and Carl followed the river deeper into the valley. The water's flow was comforting, rhythmic, a grounding element amid chaos. Yet the forest's influence remained, subtle and pervasive. Shadows danced differently here. Noises were sharper, more distinct. A bird's call seemed too melodic, almost taunting, echoing unnaturally through the trees. Carl's mind was alert, every nerve on edge. By late afternoon, the terrain became more challenging. Rocks jutted from the ground, roots twisted like serpents, and the path narrowed, forcing him into precarious positions. He stumbled once, nearly falling into a shallow ravine. The river's edge offered some stability, but Carl understood that safety was an illusion. The forest was testing him, molding the day into a psychological gauntlet. The night arrived, and Carl decided to make camp near a cluster of dense fir trees. He built a fire, small but functional, casting light over a narrow radius. Shadows writhed like living things in the glow, stretching and contracting with the flame. Carl ate sparingly, his stomach churning, both from hunger and unease. The whispers returned, clearer than ever, weaving into sentences and commands. "Carl, why do you resist? Come to us. The forest understands. Your pain is ours." He gripped his knife, trying to distinguish reality from illusion. The wind carried voices from unknown directions, some soft, others harsh, but all compelling. The forest's intent was clear. It was studying him, assessing his resolve, testing his limits. Carl knew that only by maintaining clarity of mind could he survive the night. Around midnight, a new presence made itself known. A shape emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight. A figure crouched, almost blending with the shadows, its eyes faintly luminescent, fixed on Carl. He froze, unwilling to provoke whatever it was. The figure tilted its head, as if observing, then moved closer, fluidly, almost gliding over the forest floor. Carl held his breath, listening intently to each sound: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the shifting of shadows. When the figure came into the firelight, he saw its form more clearly: elongated limbs, a distorted humanoid shape, skin darkened like tree bark, eyes that seemed impossibly deep. And yet, it did not attack. Instead, it crouched at the edge of the clearing, observing, patient. Carl realized that brute force was useless here. Only cunning, patience, and adaptability could ensure survival. Sleep was impossible. Carl remained alert, maintaining a vigil over the fire, every sense heightened. The forest was alive in ways he had never imagined, communicating through sound, movement, and the inexplicable sense of being watched. Hours stretched endlessly, each minute a test of endurance. Occasionally, the figure would move away, only to return, always observing. Carl began to notice patterns. The creature avoided certain light, moved along the periphery of shadows, and seemed to be reacting to his own behavior. The forest and its inhabitant were locked in a silent dialogue, and he was caught in the middle, a participant in a game whose rules he did not yet understand. Fear, once overwhelming, became a tool, a sharpened awareness, a guide through the darkness. By dawn, Carl decided to follow the river upstream, hoping it would lead to higher ground and, possibly, escape. The journey was exhausting. Slippery rocks, hidden roots, and the constant need for vigilance slowed his pace. The whispers persisted, but he began to differentiate between false leads and reality. His observations became methodical. Movements in the shadows, patterns in the whispering, anomalies in the terrain. Gradually, Carl discerned that the forest operated on cycles, responding to stimuli, testing reactions. He began to use this knowledge to his advantage, manipulating paths and sounds to mislead the figure that followed. Each step forward was calculated, every pause deliberate, a delicate dance with the unseen presence. Around midday, he reached a ridge overlooking the valley floor. From this vantage, the forest appeared both serene and menacing. The river snaked through the trees, its surface glinting in the sunlight. But below, shadows moved. Carl crouched, studying the valley. He noticed movement. A second figure, smaller, almost human, but distorted in posture and proportion. The two figures mirrored each other, a predator and observer, both tracking him. Carl realized that the forest was not acting randomly. It had a hierarchy, a system of guardians and watchers. Understanding this became essential. He planned his descent carefully, using fallen logs, dense underbrush, and river bends to shield his movements. Every misstep could alert them. Every sound could be fatal. By late afternoon, Carl discovered remnants of human activity. Old shelters, abandoned tools, and faded markings etched into tree bark. Some were warnings, others seemed ritualistic, unknown symbols that twisted reality. He realized he was not the first to enter this domain. Countless others had ventured too far, becoming part of the forest's enduring memory. The thought was chilling, but also enlightening. Survival depended on recognition and respect. The forest demanded acknowledgement, attention, and adaptation. Carl adjusted his tactics accordingly, moving with deliberate slowness, covering tracks, and creating diversions. He learned to anticipate the creature's responses, using instinct, observation, and memory to carve a path towards safety. Night fell again, and Carl found a narrow ledge along the riverbank to camp. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, weaving together voices from his past and imagined futures. Shadows stretched long, reaching toward the fire, morphing into shapes that suggested both danger and invitation. The elongated figure appeared once more, crouching beyond the light, observing with intent. Carl's sleep was non-existent. Every moment was vigilance, every second a negotiation with survival. The forest's intelligence was undeniable. It adapted, learned, responded. Carl understood that brute force or hasty escape would fail. Only patience, ingenuity, and awareness could allow him to survive the night. Carl awoke before dawn, the chill biting through his thin jacket. The forest was still, almost eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few glowing embers, and the shadows were long, stretched by the dim light of the rising moon. He moved carefully, gathering his belongings and scanning the perimeter. The elongated figure had not returned during the night, but Carl knew better than to assume safety. This was the final test, he realized, the culmination of the forest's relentless psychological trial. Every step from here would be crucial, a delicate balance of caution and determination. He followed the river downstream, relying on his memory and instincts to navigate. The terrain was less treacherous than the previous days, yet it was deceptive. Fallen logs, slick rocks, and sudden drops challenged his progress. Occasionally, he would glimpse movement in the underbrush, shadows darting just beyond his line of sight. Sometimes he heard whispers, soft and melodic, interspersed with warnings. Do not leave. You are ours. Stay. Carl forced himself to ignore the voices, focusing instead on rhythm, breath, and survival. Each step forward became a mantra, each breath a grounding exercise. The forest was not only a physical obstacle, but a mental one. And he had learned that the mind could betray another as easily as the terrain. Around mid-morning, he noticed a change in the forest's tone. The whispers became less coherent, more frantic, almost pleading. Shadows shifted differently, no longer stalking him, but reacting to his movements with hesitation. Carl realized that he had begun to influence the environment. that the forest was testing his understanding and adaptability. He moved cautiously, taking advantage of this subtle shift, adjusting his pace and direction to create misleads for the unseen presences. By manipulating sound, light, and timing, he was beginning to navigate the forest on his terms, using his observation skills and knowledge of survival to carve a path forward. The river eventually widened into a shallow, rapid-filled stream. Carl waded carefully, feeling the icy water against his legs. As he reached the opposite bank, he noticed tracks. Human-like, but distorted, impossibly long and irregular. They led deeper into the forest, not away from him, suggesting a deliberate path designed to lure or test intruders. Carl hesitated, evaluating the situation. Following the tracks could be a trap, yet avoiding them might leave him wandering aimlessly. He chose a compromise. He would move parallel to the tracks, keeping them within sight while seeking a natural exit from the valley. Every step was calculated, measured, a negotiation with an environment that had become almost sentient. As dusk approached, Carl found a narrow ridge overlooking a wide expanse of forest. The view was both breathtaking and ominous. Dense trees stretched endlessly, interspersed with patches of fog that obscured the ground below. The forest seemed alive, breathing in sync with him, aware of his presence. From this vantage, he could see subtle patterns, paths where the undergrowth was disturbed, slight variations in color and texture, suggesting animal or human activity. The elongated figure appeared briefly, crouched on a distant ridge, observing. Carl froze, heart pounding, and then moved silently, using the ridges and shadows to remain undetected. The forest had become a game of chess. Each move deliberate, each pause crucial. Night fell, colder than the previous nights, and Carl made camp in a small hollow protected by dense underbrush. The whispers returned, insistent and layered, voices from his past mingling with imagined threats. Shadows seemed to creep toward him, twisting in ways that defied physics. He focused on survival techniques he had honed over the past days: fire management, careful observation, and route planning. Sleep was impossible, but rest came in short, vigilant bursts. He monitored the perimeter continuously, eyes and ears straining for any sign of movement. The forest, he understood, was testing not only his body, but his perception, his ability to distinguish reality from hallucination, danger from imagination. By midnight, Carl decided to move again. Staying stationary increased risk, especially with the forest's sentient presence so close. He packed his minimal supplies and began moving along a narrow game trail. The elongated figure emerged once more, but this time Carl observed carefully before reacting. Its movements were predictable, patterned, as if following a code. Using this insight, he altered his path subtly, creating diversions by throwing small branches and stones to mislead the creature. The forest seemed to respond, the shadows twisting and redirecting as the figure followed the false signals. Carl realized he had achieved a fragile control, a temporary dominance in a domain that had tested him relentlessly. Hours passed, the trail winding through dense thickets and shallow ravines. Carl remained vigilant, aware that any lapse could be fatal. He encountered obstacles, fallen trees, slick moss, and patches of swampy ground that threatened to impede progress. The whispers persisted, but Carl's mind had grown sharper. More disciplined, he distinguished patterns in the voices, recognizing which were intended to mislead and which reflected the forest's warnings. He learned to move silently, using natural cover, blending with shadows, and exploiting the landscape's nuances. The forest had become a challenge of intellect as well as endurance, a trial of adaptability, patience, and perception. As dawn approached, Carl saw a faint glow ahead, sunlight filtering through the dense canopy. He quickened his pace, heart racing, aware that he was approaching a potential exit. The shadows and whispers diminished subtly, as if acknowledging his understanding and determination. He reached a small clearing, overgrown but distinct, where the forest floor gave way to a worn dirt path. Relief washed over him, but he remained cautious, knowing the forest had tested him thoroughly and might still harbor surprises. He followed the path carefully, each step deliberate, ears attuned to every sound, eyes scanning for any threat. By late morning, Carl emerged from the dense canopy into a more open area where the sun illuminated a network of trails and small cabins, remnants of past human activity. The presence of civilization was unmistakable, though sparse and abandoned in places. He recognized the contrast immediately. The open spaces and structured paths offered safety and predictability absent in the backwoods. The forest behind him seemed to recoil, its shadows retreating, the whispers fading into distant echoes. Carl allowed himself a brief moment of relief, acknowledging that his perseverance, observation, and adaptability had granted him passage through a domain that had tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally. The final stretch involved navigating these remnants carefully. Abandoned cabins provided temporary shelter and landmarks, while subtle signs indicated the continued presence of wildlife and possibly other, less tangible entities. Carl moved with caution, yet confidence now tempered by experience. Each step was deliberate, informed by the lessons learned over days of isolation and confrontation. He passed rusted tools, remnants of previous explorers, and natural markers left by forest creatures. The contrast between these signs of civilization and the oppressive wilderness he had traversed reinforced the trial's magnitude. He had survived a test that few could endure, emerging stronger, more aware, and profoundly changed. By afternoon, Carl reached a dirt road, the first clear indication of accessible civilization. Exhaustion weighed heavily on his body, Yet a surge of relief and triumph invigorated him. The forest behind him stretched endlessly, shadows receding, whispers silenced. The experience had been harrowing, yet it revealed a truth he could not ignore. Survival required more than strength or skill. It demanded observation, adaptability, mental fortitude, and an understanding of the environment's subtle cues. The forest had tested him in every way imaginable, and he had emerged alive, not just because of luck, but because of awareness, discipline, and resilience. Carl paused at the road, looking back once more at the dense wilderness. The towering trees, twisted shadows, and echoes of whispers would haunt him forever, etched into memory. Yet he understood that fear was a tool, not an enemy, a force to guide, caution, and sharpen instincts. He had walked through terror, navigated the unknown, and endured isolation and psychological strain beyond imagination. The forest, vast and imposing, had become a teacher, revealing the boundaries of human endurance and the power of perception. As he stepped forward onto the road, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. A survivor, tempered by adversity, carrying lessons no classroom could teach. Eventually, a vehicle approached. A lone driver, cautious but curious. Carl flagged them down, and the driver's eyes widened at his appearance. Mud-caked, bloodied from minor scratches, weary yet alert. As he climbed in, Carl recounted his journey briefly, careful to preserve his sanity and composure. The driver listened, skeptical but respectful, nodding as Carl described the obstacles, the whispers, the sentient forest. The vehicle moved steadily towards civilization, leaving the dense valley behind. Carl's gaze returned once more to the receding wilderness, a mix of relief, respect, and lingering unease settling in his chest. He knew the forest would endure, patient and eternal, ready for the next unwary traveler. But he had conquered its trials and would carry its lessons always.